So welcome everyone to this week's Discovery session. My name is Corey Diamond. I am the Executive Director at Efficiency Canada. I am subbing in for your regular host, Natalie, who is hosting an award ceremony this afternoon, so can't make it. So thank you for joining us. We've got a great session today with two of my colleagues and friends, James Gaede and Brendan Haley, who are going to be giving you insight and go a little bit deeper into what we discovered through our energy efficiency scorecard, which was released this week. So as we normally do with these sessions, we try to stick to 20-25 minutes of presentations, and then we want to spend the bulk of the remainder of the time in getting questions from you. So please use the Q&A box as you hear things that jog some questions, and then I will be quarterbacking and facilitating the Q&A with the guests afterwards. So that's at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We do have a hard stop at 12:45. We want to honor your lunch break or your breakfast break, your afternoon snack, and wherever you are in the country, to get back to the rest of your day so that you can get on with your weekend. So without further ado, I'm pleased to welcome our guest today. Brendan Haley is the Policy Director at Efficiency Canada, and James Gaede is the Senior Research Associate at Efficiency Canada. And as I said, they're going to be diving into the results of this year's scorecard that we released yesterday. So I think, James, you're up first, so take it away.
Great, thanks, Corey, and welcome everybody to our little talk on the 2021 scorecard, which was just released yesterday. So just to start off, let's quickly look at what the agenda of this webinar is going to be. I'm going to start off by talking about the purpose and methodology of the scorecard. Then I'll look at some of the high-level 2021 results that we found. Then I'm going to pass it over to Brendan, who will do a little bit more of a deeper dive on provincial strengths and areas of opportunities. And then finally back to me to remind you all to visit our policy database. So without further ado, why don't we get started? Okay, so first up, scorecard purpose and methodology. So what is the scorecard? The scorecard is a transparent and evidence-based annual assessment of provincial energy efficiency policy frameworks across Canada. The report tracks what we call both policy and outcome metrics. So outcome metrics are more quantitative and looking at things like energy savings, how much energy savings have been achieved by energy efficiency programs, whereas policy metrics tend to be more qualitative, looking at whether or to what extent a province has a particular energy efficiency policy in place, such as, to give you an example, like building energy rating and disclosure programs. So we tried to make the outcomes worth a little bit more points in the overall scorecard. And you can see here, there's a little table showing that outcome metrics are worth on their own just about half of the total available points in the scorecard. However, some of the metrics are a little mixed in that they have a policy component and an outcome component. And so if you factor that in, then outcome metrics are worth a little bit more than half of the points in the whole scorecard. So the objective of the scorecard is basically to benchmark the provinces and to share best practices in energy efficiency across Canada. And we think that this is a pretty useful tool, both for provincial and federal government policymakers, but also for local activists and basically anybody working in the energy efficiency sector. And we also like to think that the scorecard promotes some friendly competition amongst the provinces as well. To improve their own policy frameworks and to achieve greater energy efficiency outcomes overall. So the process of producing the scorecard takes pretty much an entire year. I mentioned, and as many of you probably know, we released the 2021 scorecard yesterday. I haven't yet started working on the next one. But we will start working on that very soon, probably in the next couple of weeks, which is typically consists of a little bit of a planning phase where Brendan and I and some of the other people at Efficiency Canada will meet to discuss, what went well, what could be improved, areas to add or to expand our coverage on. Then we move into a research phase, which is usually in the spring. This consists both of desk research in Efficiency Canada, but also sending out an information request to people that work with us on the scorecard across Canada. That's energy efficiency program administrators and provincial governments. That process takes about a month, and then when we get the information back, we begin combining and collating and reviewing and analyzing all that information over the course of the summer, with the aim of producing a draft report by Labor Day weekend, which is then sent back for review, both by a series of expert peer reviewers across the country that we've identified over the years, as well as the people that contribute information in the information request. That takes about 2 to 3 weeks. Then they send back their comments and suggested revisions, which we take into consideration, with the goal of producing the final report in mid-November, which we just did. So another way of looking at that, and also helping to understand what coverage a scorecard is covering, is this diagram here. So year one is the scorecard year, and by that I mean the year in which the data is that we're looking at. Whereas year two is the production year. So when I say that we just released our 2021 scorecard, that's the production year, but it's looking at data primarily from 2020. Now, I say primarily from because the period of coverage is actually closer to 18 months. And that's partly because we need to accommodate the fact that some program administrators report their results on a calendar year basis running from January to December, whereas others report on a fiscal year basis, which is generally speaking April to March the following year. Now, we also allow a little bit of a policy implementation grace period. This is in part because, we realize that it takes time for some of these announced policies to become implemented, but also because, we want to ensure that when the scorecard is released later in the fall of the production year, that we are as up to date as we can be within reason in terms of what's happening. Okay, so moving on, I'm going to look quickly at some of the methodological changes we made this year. The report this year is tracking 54 different metrics for energy efficiency. That's up from 42 last year, across the same 5 broad policy areas that we've always tracked, which is to say energy efficiency programs, enabling policies, buildings, transportation, and industry. Programs is primarily outcome metrics, so it happens to be worth the most overall points in the scorecard, although this year it has been reduced by 2 points from 40 to 38 points. In enabling policies, there's no change overall in terms of the weighting of that section, although we did introduce a series of new metrics under the training and professionalization category, where we look at workforce readiness plans and studies and activities in the provinces. Okay, moving on. So in the building section, the total available points went down a little bit, and that's because we've reduced points that we formerly awarded to adoption of older building codes. But we also introduced a new metric looking at building performance standards. The net change ended up being a little bit less points. Transportation, on the other hand, increased by 3.5 points, and that's largely because of the introduction of 3 new metrics looking at public transit, support for public transit and public transit ridership. Oh, and also electrification of bus fleets in the provinces. And then finally, we didn't make any changes overall to the industry section, so the weighting remains the same. So I just want to but pause for a second to just discuss how to think about the scoring. So the total available points in the scorecard is always 100 points. But what we want to make sure is that people aren't thinking about the scores that provinces are getting as being equivalent to a letter grade. If that were the case, then only one province this year got more than 50 out of 100. But we don't like to think about it in terms of pass fails or A's and B's. Instead, we like to think about it kind of like scaling a mountain of energy efficiency performance that all provinces are able to climb, although maybe some of them are at different stages in the overall ascent toward peak efficiency, although peak efficiency would change with time, of course. But we just want to make sure that when we're talking about the scoring of the provinces, we're not talking about letter grades per se, but more trying to view the provinces in kind of ranks or tiers of like 10 points. So 10 to 19 points, 20 to 29 points, and so on. Okay, so with that out of the way, now let's turn to some of the high-level results that I mentioned earlier. I'm going to start off by looking at some Canada-wide energy savings and spending figures. So this chart in front of you is showing an unfortunate downward trend in net annual incremental energy savings since 2017, and it's showing it by the fuel type of savings. So there's electricity, natural gas, non-regulated fuels, and then there's a small little category that's called multi-fuel, and that is mainly representing savings from program administrators that don't differentiate between the two fuels. And so generally speaking, that's program savings from natural gas and non-regulated fuels, but they just can't be broken out. Now, the biggest contributor, sorry, just to mention this drop is equivalent to about 38%. It's a 38% drop from the peak of around 23 petajoules of savings in 2017. So that's, for reference, 1 petajoule is about enough to power 9,000 homes for a year. Now, the biggest contributor to the reduction is a reduction in electricity savings. And although I should note that natural gas savings did decline pretty significantly since 2019 as well, which you can see in the second bar of the stacked bar chart. And a lot of the reduction in electricity savings is actually due to reduced savings in Ontario. So this is another chart. This is basically the same chart, except it's showing the incremental savings by province. I've lumped most of the provinces together as rest of Canada, but I just wanted to highlight the trends in Ontario and Alberta versus Quebec and British Columbia. So you can see Ontario is the bottom component of this stacked area chart, and it's declined quite significantly since 2017. So that's corresponding with the ending of the conservation first framework and its replacement with an interim framework, and now subsequent, eventually we'll see next year in the data, it's the new framework, the 2021 to 2024 CDM framework in Ontario. Also, you'll see that there's a pretty big decline in savings in Alberta, which was performed quite well in 2017 with the launch of Energy Efficiency Alberta, although has whittled down to a rather small amount. Conversely, when you look at Quebec and British Columbia, we can see that they're kind of remaining constant in their savings, which is good, but there's a lot more savings potential out there that'll be necessary to ramp up to meet if we hope to meet some of our climate goals. Okay, so this chart is showing nationwide program spending. The trend is a little bit different than the trend in energy savings. You can see that we tracked $1.13 billion in energy efficiency program spending in 2020, down a little bit from 1.22 billion in 2018. And most of that is a result of reduced spending in electricity programs. Now, I should note multi-fuel is quite a much bigger component in this graph, and that's partly because of, as with the energy savings program administrators that couldn't differentiate their spending by the type of fuel that those programs would be achieving energy savings, but it's also including components that don't necessarily apply to a particular fuel, which could include like enabling strategies or related activities that help facilitate energy efficiency programs, but aren't themselves incentive programs. Okay, and then finally, before I turn it over to Brendan, this is the table of the overall scoring results by the provinces this year. I'm not going to go too deep into it because Brendan's going to speak more about each province individually coming up. But I just wanted to note that the top 5 provinces did not change in rank this year, and Manitoba dropped the most by two spots. Based on the research that we did for the scorecard, we think a lot of that is attributable to the COVID-19 pandemic. It happened to coincide with the transference of energy efficiency programming from Manitoba Hydro to Efficiency Manitoba in April 2020, and which was right at the start of the pandemic. And so there was it was a bit of a rocky start getting programs up and running in Manitoba. Okay, so with that, I'm going to wrap up my part and I'll pass it over to Brendan to talk about provincial highlights.
Great. Thanks, James, and hi, everyone. So at the end of the scorecard report, and if you go to our website, you can see these handy one-page descriptions that we produce for every single province. And those identify strengths and further opportunities, as well as policy events that have happened in the last year in every province. So I'm not going to be able to go through every province in detail. I'm going to take you through some of the highlights fairly quickly. So let's start with British Columbia. BC is the top scoring province again, and this is actually not even counting the new commitments that have just recently been made under an updated climate plan. One interesting finding is that this year we were able to track the effect of the pandemic on savings, and BC utilities are really the only ones that have that did not see a decrease in savings. There was a deliberate strategy there to increase incentive levels in response to the pandemic. So we all know BC is having a tough week, and BC is experiencing some major climate impacts. If you're like me and the rest of the country, you're watching those events and hopefully reflecting on how best to respond to the climate emergency. And one way other jurisdictions could do that is actually to start replicating some of BC's policies, which include zero carbon building codes now, electric vehicle mandates that have been accelerated, and home energy, moving forward on home energy labels. So the next tier of provinces, we see Quebec is in second place. And that is largely due to continued leadership on transportation. Quebec also tends to score quite high on natural gas savings. That's traditionally because of strong industrial programs. In the future, we expect to see more strategic electrification of heating in Quebec. The two utilities there have come together on a joint dual fuel decarbonization strategy that's proposed before the provincial regulator. Nova Scotia is in third. It continues to have strong performance on efficiency programs. There's been some recent movement in this year to promote vehicle electrification in the province. Perhaps what you don't see in Nova Scotia as much as in, say, BC, is a market transformation strategies leading towards mandatory government policies such as net zero building codes or building labeling. So when we come to the fourth tier now, Ontario's dropped down to this tier. Ontario continues to do quite well, and that's largely because of some legacy policies, such as being the only province right now with mandatory building energy reporting. Continued interesting work going on there by the ISO on grid modernization. But as James said, it's in this 2020 data that you can really see the impact of the budget caps that were imposed on electricity programs by the government. And that has a big impact on the overall national savings in the country. PEI stays in the same place, but they receive the top rank in the programs category, quite far ahead in that category. And right now, there's an active discussion in that province of moving electricity savings to 2% of sales in the next DSM plan. And that would be higher than anywhere else in Canada right now. To reach that level of savings consistently, it's going to be important for PEI to have some enabling policies, such as building energy labels, building energy reporting, industrial energy management systems in place. So as James said, in the next tier of provinces, there's been some movement here. New Brunswick, that's a province that has been strategizing for many years now around grid modernization, around smart infrastructure. And there's been some breakthroughs recently with approval of an advanced meter rollout strategy in that province. As well as one thing we do is we track energy efficient research grants. And New Brunswick this year had the highest concentration going towards demand side innovation or demand side research. In Alberta, you got to look to municipalities and industry if you want to find some good energy efficiency news in Alberta. We now see municipalities launching PACE financing programs. We also included data this year on electrification of bus transit fleets. And surprisingly to me, at least, Alberta's in the lead there, and that's largely due to Edmonton. So James already discussed Manitoba, and that's a province I think you can really see the impact of the pandemic. But in that province, we also see they're still using the 2011 version of the building code. When federal funds were available for programs in that province, those funds were not used recently to expand Efficiency Manitoba activities, and funding like that could be put to good use. Manitoba is now in 7th place in terms of per capita spending. So finally, this last tier of provinces, we saw a flip this year. So Saskatchewan bumped up. That's largely with the province enabling PACE legislation. And then when we come to Newfoundland and Labrador, they've got a really interesting DSM plan that is based on maintaining efficiency programs and then promoting electrification in anticipation of the surplus from Muskrat Falls. So they're doing things there by counting non-electric benefits of lower fuel maintenance costs associated with electrification and things like cost effectiveness tests. So if you're a utility regulatory nerd like me, I think there's some really innovative aspects of the forward-looking plan. However, we track, we're weighted towards realized performance and not plans, and that I think explains the position of Newfoundland and Labrador this year. So next, this year, we also, with some help from our friend Mohammed, who's a co-author of the report, he helped us to have a fuller discussion of the territories. So when we look at the territories and we benchmark them on some of our metrics, Yukon is actually ahead of other jurisdictions in per capita spending, not far behind on electricity savings. There's an important policy story there because Yukon's main electricity utility was prevented from investing in energy efficiency by its regulator. We moved to the Northwest Territories. Similarly, we see high spending, relatively high spending overall, as well as in low income programs. And so this year we've got sort of more infographic descriptions for these two territories because we were able to collect sufficient data. Okay, so next I want to move to federal recommendations because the scorecard, it's an opportunity to think about federal and provincial policy interactions. So this is a hot topic this year. We've got the Greener Homes program entering into a market where many provincial policy programs also exist. A bunch of new federal policy announcements have been made over the past year. And I think at the federal level, you could say that there's been some policy momentum for energy efficiency, and it's kind of in contradiction with this provincial savings slowdown that we're seeing. But we're also seeing some stalling in other areas. In particular, I'd emphasize net zero building codes here. In every scorecard, we've been talking about how the new building code in 2020, which is called the 2020 building code, is going to come out any day now. And it has not yet been released. Even though it's the 2020 building code, it's the end of 2021, it's not yet released. We now have the Liberal Party that campaigned on a platform and now has a mandate to actually speed up the adoption of net zero building codes to the year 2025, whereas previously it was 2030. They also want to add emissions to that code, a code that's been largely focused on energy. So if the federal government really wants to accelerate this, I think we're going to need a funded strategy to promote provincial code adoption and compliance, given the delays of the code being published and an accelerated timeline. So our first recommendation concerns taking leadership on building codes. Second recommendation, this is from a report I co-authored earlier this year about transforming the building retrofit process to achieve deeper savings, quicker speeds at lower costs. And so when we look at many of these provincial policy systems, they can be constrained in their ability to kind of experiment with deep energy retrofit solutions because of cost effectiveness tests and things like that being, focus on measurable results can be quite restrictive. So a more mission-oriented strategy to reshape how retrofit markets function would be a nice complement to provinces, which are fairly good at encouraging the adoption of cost-effective solutions. Third area concerns expanding the scale and scope of low-income energy efficiency. This remains a big gap in federal policy, and it's an area where a well-thought-out approach can leverage existing program infrastructure at that provincial level, perhaps adding new objectives associated with decreasing energy poverty and achieving GHG goals. And then finally, James does, I think, some of the most detailed tracking now of energy management systems and industry through the scorecard. And the federal government, it's got an existing program, it's got a policy target to encourage energy management certification, but that has not seen an increase in funding or even a way to benchmark towards that goal. So we think this is an example where that provincial program infrastructure can be leveraged to encourage the federal government's more process-oriented goal associated with energy management systems. We're going to be coming out with some further research on that this year, I'm happy to say. So I'm now going to quickly hand it back to James, who's going to chat about our all-important policy database.
Great, thanks, Brendan. So I'll just take a quick minute or two just to mention the policy database, which we release alongside the scorecard. And just actually on the scorecard, before I forget, all of the material that, well, actually, I don't know how we share the presentations for Discovery, but the scorecard material, which is the report, translated versions of the executive summaries and the provincial summaries for Manitoba, New Brunswick, and Quebec, as well as the one-pagers for each province, are all available at scorecard.efficiencycanada.org. So you can view kind of all of the stuff that we've seen in more depth by going to that URL. But a different URL is the database, which is database.efficiencycanada.org. And it's a bit of a companion product to the scorecard. So basically what it is it's more narrative information on a variety of different topics for each province across the 5 policy areas that we track in the scorecard. Some of this material can be found in the scorecard. Some of it is stuff that's not necessarily in the scorecard, but it is a useful tool to compare and contrast across the provinces or across province or policy area. So users can view it by, you can go to a province and see all the items for that province, or you can go to a policy area and then see all the info for each province, and in some cases for the territories, all in one shot. So it's pretty easy for comparison, for comparing. You can also, mainly we update this in around the update of the scorecard, but we're always, trying to keep it up to date. So if you see something that's out of date, or if you have any ideas for suggestions, you can email them directly to me at james.gaede@efficiencycanada.org. Okay, and that concludes the presentation on Scorecard 2021.
Excellent. Nice work, gentlemen. Thank you. So very active in Q&A. So I'm going to try and batch a few of these questions and kind of throw them your way. So a couple questions related to the distinction between energy and emissions. Adrian asked kind of, are the figures and results a goal towards net zero energy or net zero emissions? And Alex also asked kind of, do you have a view that focuses specifically on decarbonization, so reduction in GHG? So I don't know if you want to address both those together.
I can answer that. So I would say that, the top benchmarks are informed by where we need to go, we feel, for climate change. So even if you look at, the top province, BC, that the score is 55 out of 100. So that thinking goes into we're trying to benchmark on where we feel we need to go. I guess on the scorecard is focused on energy efficiency, and one of the reasons we don't explicitly focus on emissions per se is because sometimes that can almost be almost be used as a justification for, say, wasting a bunch of energy in a province like Quebec, where they have a bunch of clean, hydroelectricity, right? Whereas when you think about what we need from a systemic point of that broader transition, energy efficiency in Quebec frees up a whole bunch of hydroelectricity that can then be used for meet their electrification objectives on, transportation, industry, and then exports to the rest of the world. So a lot of the metrics are, focused on energy, but with kind of an objective of thinking of where we need to go on climate change, but also where we need to go on a whole bunch of other objectives, such as adapting to climate change, having more resilient buildings, dealing with energy poverty, is also in there.
Great, thanks for that. There's a question that got upvoted, and then someone else really wanted to know the answer too. Is this if we're planning something similar for cities, given that how active cities are on climate issues, and it comes with a really nice compliment to both of you about the organization of the presentation and the care you put into it. So be nice with your answer.
James, you want me to try to tackle that one too? Yeah, that was, doing this is a huge amount of work. And I think we would love to do on cities, but we also have really understood the time and resources that would be required to do a city or a municipal scorecard, where we're really pride ourselves on being evidence-based and really looking at the metrics on this. So that is, I would love to take that as a suggestion, and we would love to explore funding options and resource options to do that. One reason we didn't start with cities at first, and there is some resources out there on municipalities. One is that Quest, a strong allied and partner organization, has what they call a Smart Cities benchmark, and they looked at a similar scorecard type model to try to give cities some pathways forward. They don't do what we do, which is, we rank provinces. But that's not the first time we've heard that comment. So thanks for that, and we'll maybe in the future we'll try to consider that.
Great. A couple more technical questions related to methodology. One around how Asan asked how incremental energy savings are calculated, and then secondly, Marie Claude asked how do we count for the spending counts for codes and standards, but wasn't sure if the savings also counts on the codes and standards part. So maybe answer both those from a methodology perspective.
Sure, I can speak to that. So the answer is that I guess it's quite complicated. So I can tell you, so with the calculation of net incremental energy savings, so basically what that means is that is estimated energy savings associated with a program that operated in a year for that year, right? So it would, how program administrators would go about evaluating the energy savings achieved from their program operations in a given year is probably going to differ according to what type of measure it is. If it's like replacing a light bulb or something, there's a certain energy efficiency factor, and then there will be assumptions around its use and behavior, and basically that all kind of bubbles up into like official kind of demand side management reporting. So at Efficiency Canada, what we do is we largely rely upon demand side management reporting from the program administrators. And we also track whether or not it's been evaluated by a third party. So there's standardized evaluation and verification methodologies that go into these types of things. Okay, so that is what a net incremental energy saving is and how we track it. I can't speak to the nitty gritty of how they're calculated for each and every individual measure within all the various programs that are included within of our broader kind of tracking. What I would say is that, these demand side energy management reports are not just promotional material. Like utilities are going to rely on estimates of energy savings to inform their resource planning. So it's not as though that these are kind of fabricated or something like that, or they're relatively concrete estimates of energy savings associated with our program activities. Now, coming back to the other question on codes and standards. So we do track codes and standards spending, and we do track savings from codes and standards. Although not many provinces actually track savings from codes and standards or include it in their official reporting. Although there is a component of, so there are savings being achieved through codes and standards, but they were not represented in that chart that I presented in the presentation. An earlier version of it did have it, but the actual official reported savings from codes and standards is quite small in proportion to the program savings that the chart was showing in this presentation. I think that was both components of it, right?
Yeah, I think it was. Okay, I'm gonna try to batch a few, but this one's just a one-off. It is kind of related to the GHG question as well. David asked, how do we change to reflect fuel switching to electrification in addition to efficiency? So I think what he's trying to say is, what connection does scoring and tracking and benchmarking that we're doing on the scorecard reflect electrification or heat pump type programs?
I can take that one, James. So we do include electrification. Electrification is included in fossil fuel savings. So essentially we look at, if you can save fossil fuels in multiple ways. And one of the ways you can do that is by switching to a different fuel type. And then we've been trying to figure out how much of those savings are coming from electrification. And there's some information in there, but we do have to actually improve our tracking of that and try to figure out, working with provinces and utilities, how we can track that a little bit better. I think in future years we would, so in BC, for instance, they've just announced a policy to make sure all heating systems by 2030 in the province need to be 100% efficient. So that basically means the use of heat pumps and or electric resistance, perhaps as the needed backup to those heat pumps. And before we tracked, market transformation activities towards those goals. So in the future, I think we will have to start thinking a little bit more about on the heating side, some of those market transformation objectives and which provinces are doing well.
Okay. I'm going to try and batch together three of Heather's questions. The first is on what information do you need from the territories, so to kind of fill in the gaps on the data there. And secondly, related to the national energy savings that we mentioned, that it was like, national energy savings are from reduced spending. Does that mean, is that from a cancellation of programs or reduced money for existing programs? And does that metric get a reduced effectiveness of that program? So those are the two for you. The third question she asked is about reshaping markets for retrofit. So Heather, I'm going to answer that in the chat, and I'm just going to put a link to a report that we released on that. So try and answer the other two if you can.
Okay, so I'll do my best on to answer those two questions. On the question about the territories, I'm sorry, I just don't know off the top of my head. There are a couple areas that we have historically not been able to get data on. This year, we made a huge jump in how much information we collect from the territories. And, we'll review that in the planning for 2022 scorecard. And, it's possible that we could see, the territories included alongside the provinces on many metrics, if not most of them. There are a couple that still remain to be difficult. It's not necessarily about getting information from the territories, but for some metrics we rely on other external data, from StatsCan or something like that, as like a denominator that we would use to normalize across the provinces. And it's sometimes the case that individual, like that data per territory is not available from Statistics Canada. They might aggregate them all together into one category. But we are still working with our partners, I guess, our friends in the territories to improve our methodology on collecting information and representing the full kind of gambit of the activities that are going on up there in the scorecard. On the second question was, it's gone. Corey, you erased it. It was about,
related to the reduction in national energy savings. Is that from a cancellation of programs or reduced spending in programs, and the effect that has on program cost effectiveness?
So I would have to go back and look at again individually per each program administrator, but kind of like the high level big impact here was the cancellation of the conservation first framework in Ontario and its replacement with an interim framework in around 2019, 2020 that basically did away with most residential programming. So some residential programs do still exist on the electricity side in Ontario, but I think it's mainly like an income qualified program, income qualified programming, and some like public awareness initiative. So that took a big chunk out of nationwide spending on energy efficiency programming. You know, and then there's other provinces too that have been kind of reducing. Like I think the chart showed that things are down in Alberta. But I don't, off the top of my head, I can't say for sure what the spending per each province is like in terms of a long-term trend.
Okay, we may have time for just this one, but I'm going to batch two transportation questions together. One is about EV rebates and the importance that rebates on EV programs have on savings. And then secondly, that this year we've now included a new metric on public transportation. And so are we tracking transit spending within the program spending bucket?
So a couple things on that. So yeah, we do track EV incentives in the scorecard. You know, electrification of transportation is necessary to deal with climate change, but it's also the more efficient choice. So we do track EV incentives. I wouldn't say that they are the whole basket of it's not the only thing we need to think about when we're talking about electrification of transport. So we're also looking at support for public charging installation or private charging installation and the extent of the EV charging network as well in each province. But we do track EV incentives. On the second part of that question, sorry, Corey, can you refresh my memory?
Delete them right away so I can deal with it. No, the question is around public transit. So now that we've added that metric, is that included in program spending?
Right. Well, no, it won't be, but it will continue to be in the transportation section. And the basic justification there is that it's kind of the funding for public transit is coming from an entirely different kind of policy system. So when we're talking about program spending in the program section of the scorecard, that is pretty much entirely energy efficiency programming taking place either within a utility kind of demand side management initiative or under the auspices of a dedicated agency for delivering energy efficiency programming. So public transit spending itself will not show up in there.
Got it. Thank you. Unfortunately, we won't be able to get to the rest of the questions. However, there is a contact email on here. You can reach all of us on LinkedIn, and some of us are in social media. So please, we'll continue the conversation through different channels. We love doing this. And so we know there's a lot of interest related to Scorecard across the country in different provinces and regions, and we want to support you in giving you the information you need. So please do reach out. And we love doing discovery. Like every week we are continued to be amazed at how many people show up to this session and learn alongside us. So thank you for joining us. We really do appreciate all the great questions. Thanks to James and Brendan, not only for today's presentation, but for getting through the scorecard for another year. And James will be starting 2022 on Monday. And with that, we wish you all an excellent weekend, and we hope everything is what you planned for the weekend, and have an awesome time. And we'll see you back here next week for another discovery session where Natalie will be back in the seat and walking you through yet another great session. Thanks, everyone.